The torrential rain showed no sign of letting up. Streams of water lashed the ground, running down the rough trunks of trees and pooling in muddy patches on the dirt road. The refugees, huddled beneath the canopies of ancient oaks, pressed closely together, hoping the downpour would soon stop. Richard, sitting a little apart from the group, carefully scanned the surroundings. His eyes were trained to notice even the slightest movement among the shadows of the forest, for in recent weeks, monsters had swarmed these lands like never before. They appeared without warning, like wild beasts, devouring careless travelers. Richard was prepared. His hands tightly gripped the hilt of his sword, and his ears caught every sound in the surrounding silence. They had recently crossed a river, where they encountered a terrible creature, a massive beast, more like a nightmare than something from this world. The battle was fierce, but they survived. Now, their path led to Amelia, a city where, according to rumors, the temple of the moon goddess stood. It was there that Richard hoped to find protection for those he led and answers to the questions that had plagued his heart for a long time. The knight adjusted his armor, which had long since become like a second skin. He rarely took it off, except when bathing. He didn't feel tired. In his wolf form, he knew neither cold nor fatigue. His strength was almost limitless. And because of that, he could go several nights without sleep, guarding the camp from the dangers lurking in the dark. His loyal dog, Enzio, was always nearby. More accurately, not just a dog, it resembled a wolf, huge and wild, and Richard could never quite determine its breed. Enzio had grown rapidly, like a mushroom after the rain, and was now nearly as tall as Richard. The knight often wondered just how much more this creature might grow. But for now, the dog was missing somewhere in the forest, possibly patrolling the area. Sitting on watch, Richard reflected on how much they had endured in the past weeks. He remembered himself as a young man, back when he first set out on the path of knighthood. Those days seemed distant, as if they had passed centuries ago. Since then, he had faced many trials, witnessed death and suffering, but had also gained friends, those who now slept quietly beside him, exhausted from the long journey. Next to him, wrapped in armor, lay Agna, a girl who was once so young and naive. Her once innocent face now bore the marks of her experiences. The adventures had left their marks on her, making her tougher and stronger, yet her beauty had not faded. She still glowed, even in moments of rest. An old man lay nearby, leaning against his faithful donkey. He was blind. His face was disfigured by scars where his eyes once were. Richard had once tried to ask him how it happened, but the man had only turned away, lost in his grim memories. Young Mage Jenner slept as usual, with an open book in his hands. His muttering almost blended with the sound of the rain. Jenner was a mystery, a new and not fully understood ally, but he had already earned the trust of his companions. The only one missing was Lance, the last member of their group. He had appeared recently and immediately aroused Richard's suspicion. He suspected Lance was an ancient vampire, hiding under the guise of a commoner. But no one spoke about it openly. Everyone seemed to avoid the topic, accepting his help as a given. Lance had already saved them in battle more than once, and despite his inner doubts, Richard was beginning to trust him. A faint rustling caught the knight's attention. He brushed off a drop of rain that had seeped through the thick canopy and peered into the mist that stretched over the clearing ahead. Through the dense fog, a faint, flickering light appeared. At first, Richard thought it was a firefly, but the glow wasn't like the usual insect's flame. It flashed and dimmed, as if it were a living creature. A chill of unease ran down Richard's spine, but he didn't wake the others. Rising quietly, he took his sword and stepped toward the flickering light, trying to understand what was hiding in the mist. Richard moved slowly, pushing against the rain that lashed his face. The downpour was so heavy that it turned the world around him into a watery veil, making it difficult to see. The leaves and branches of trees seemed to merge together under the streams of water, and the ground beneath his feet became slippery and unstable. Darkness thickened around him, blending with the rain and fog, but Richard knew something was approaching. The feeling crept up on him like foul breath on his neck. He knew the uninvited guests were already close. Now it was just a matter of finding out what he would be facing. The sound of something sliding across the wet ground reached his ears. A faint but irritating rustle, like someone dragging a load or crawling through the mud. Richard froze, straining to listen and peer into the darkness. The distant light he had noticed earlier flickered closer. Then, out of the gloom, shapes became discernible. Slowly crawling onto the clearing in front of him were creatures that looked like a horrific mix of sea beasts and nightmares. They resembled anglerfish, with a thin stalk protruding from their heads, at the end of which a small, glowing orb illuminated the path in the dark. This light deceptively resembled a lamp, but it was eerie and unnatural. Their bodies were slick and repulsively shiny in the rain, like massive slugs, with deformed limbs and heads resembling a grotesque mess of teeth and wet tentacles. They moved with a disgusting sway, as if dragging themselves from side to side, leaving behind trails of slippery, viscous slime. The sound of their movement was like the rustling of hundreds of insects crawling over the wet ground. Richard felt a wave of revulsion, but set the feeling aside. Now was the time to act. He counted about a dozen creatures, their glowing heads floating like drifting lanterns in the night mist. The knight tightened his grip on his sword, tension flowing into his muscles as he crouched, preparing to leap. His dark armor, soaked with rain, blended with the surrounding darkness. The monsters, seemingly unable to see him in the gloom, remained unaware. Richard leapt forward with incredible speed, and with his first strike, he cleaved the nearest creature in two. It didn't even have time to react, and the sound of its body splitting echoed through the clearing as its dark mass splattered into the mud. The ground splashed beneath his feet as the knight, rolling forward, lunged at the next creature. But this one had already noticed him and spat out a strange liquid from its maw. Richard dodged just in time, but out of the corner of his eye he saw a few drops of the liquid land on his armor. The armor sizzled, began to smoke, and started melting, leaving blackened marks. Acid, he noted to himself, realizing that each contact with this substance could be fatal. He needed to act quickly. Picking up the pace, he slashed the second creature with a swift stroke of his sword. The third creature had already prepared to attack, but its acidic spit grazed Richard on the side, and his armor began to sizzle again. He felt the metal melting under the onslaught of the venom, amazed that even his most durable protective layers couldn't withstand these foul creatures' attack. Understanding that there was no time to lose, he accelerated, leaping across the field, and slashed two more creatures with a single swing of his sword. The remaining slugs began to surround him, their glowing heads swaying in a sinister dance as streams of acid spewed from their mouths, striking his armor and the ground. Suddenly, Richard heard a hissing sound. Turning, he saw a black spear, woven from energy, pierce one of the creatures. The creature began to dissolve, its dark body melting away into the earth. In the distance, he spotted Lance, his companion. The man stood, smirking, with his hand raised, from which another spear soon materialized. With skill and precision, The ancient vampire hurled it at the next creature, destroying it. Richard, wasting no time, leapt forward once more. Mid-flight, he swung his sword and cleaved the last slug in half. The creature let out a raspy, grotesque sound like air escaping from a torn bellows. He looked around. All the creatures were dead, their bodies dissolving into the ground, mixing with the rain and mud. His armor, damaged by the acid, was melting in places. The knight thought of how careless he had been, and it angered him. His magnificent armor, the pride of his craftsmanship, now needed serious repair. But there was no choice. Nothing could be done about it. Richard stood up straight and surveyed the area, expecting to see his loyal dog. But Enzio was nowhere to be found. "Where were you when these creatures got so close?" thought the knight, still worried about his faithful companion. He checked to make sure everything was in order and nodded to Lance, signaling that they could return. The silent vampire merely smiled slyly in response, glancing at the battlefield. Richard made his way back to the camp, thinking about how many more monsters they would encounter on their journey. The camp remained unchanged. The sound of the rain had drowned out the noise of the battle, and the sleeping refugees had no idea what had taken place just a few steps away. Richard, having returned to his spot, sat under a tree, leaning against the trunk, allowing the tension to drain away. Lance did not follow him. He melted into the darkness, heading into the woods, likely checking to see if any further danger lurked nearby. With companions like this, Richard felt much more at ease. It was comforting to know he could rely on someone in such a dangerous and unpredictable world. By morning, the rain had stopped, and a thick, damp fog blanketed the area. It hung low over the ground, obscuring the distant horizons, and the now awake people shivered from the cold, struggling to warm themselves. The camp was quiet, with only the crackle of the fire and the murmurs of those preparing breakfast breaking the stillness. Under the gray sky, everything looked pale and muted, as though the world was waiting for something new and unknown. After everyone had eaten, the caravan set off once again. Some walked lightly, trudging through the mud, while others dragged carts loaded with supplies and belongings, straining with every step. The road, turned to mush after the night's downpour, made progress slow, and everyone moved sluggishly, as if in a half-dream. The air was damp, and each step was laborious. People spoke little, only exchanging the occasional word, but the collective exhaustion weighed heavily on them, like a heavy cloak. Richard walked behind Balthazar, who rode ahead on his faithful animal, deep in thought. The knight caught up to him, stepping closer, and asked, "How much farther to the city?" They had just begun descending into a valley where the moist fog clung to the ground. In the distance, fields stretched out, covered in tall, wet grass that glistened with droplets of moisture. Balthazar lifted his gaze from his thoughts and, with a flick of his staff, pointed ahead. "We're close. Do you see that in the distance?" Richard squinted. In the far-off distance, there was a forest, a dark band on the horizon, but he saw no city. "You're talking about the forest? Where's the city?" Balthazar chuckled softly, a slight smile playing under his hat. "Amelia is both the forest and the city. It's home to an ancient people called the Silver Sind. They live in harmony with the forest, their homes hidden among the trees." Richard raised an eyebrow in surprise. He had seen much in his years of wandering, but this still struck him as something extraordinary. This world truly was full of wondrous things and peoples. Soon, Agna caught up to them, chewing on dried meat. Richard, seeing her, paused for a moment, realizing how much this girl had changed since they first met. She had once been a graceful, well-mannered noblewoman, but now her mannerisms seemed rougher, more grounded. He wanted to make a remark about it, but she interrupted him before he could speak. "I haven't seen Enzio since yesterday," she said with concern, glancing toward the forest. Richard, too, was worried about the dog, but knew that Enzio was always able to take care of himself. Besides, he was sure the dog would return on his own, as he always did. Just as Richard calmed his thoughts, his eyes caught something silver moving toward them through the fog. Soon, he realized it was Enzio, and he sighed in relief. "There he is," he said to Agna, pointing ahead. The dog was coming toward them, carrying something that gleamed golden in the morning light, breaking through the fog. When Enzio finally reached them, he wagged his tail and playfully bounded around like a puppy, clearly happy to be reunited. Richard called him over, and the dog obediently sat on his haunches, gently laying down the object he carried in his mouth. Richard knelt to examine the find. It was a round metallic object with a golden sheen. Its surface was covered in strange runes and patterns, and its shape resembled a compass, though it lacked a needle. "What is this?" Richard frowned, not understanding the purpose of the device. He handed the object to Balthazar, who took it and inspected the ancient relic. The old man turned it over, trying to decipher its function. "I don't know, but it's something old. Something connected to those who lived long before us," he said thoughtfully. "Keep it. It may come in handy someday." Richard nodded, stowing the device in his bag. They continued their journey, and the goal of their trek now appeared on the horizon. The tiny silhouette of the forest, barely visible through the fog, gave everyone a renewed sense of energy. The caravan moved down the poorly marked road, descending into the valley. The tall, reed-like grass on either side swayed in the wind, with raindrops still glistening on its stems. Richard, moving along the column, scanned the area carefully. Such grass could hide any number of dangers, and his attention could not waver for even a moment. He called Enzio over, who was walking nearby. "Stay alert," Richard said, motioning toward the grass. The dog, as if understanding his master, barked briefly and darted into the grass to scout the area. His silver fur flickered briefly among the green stalks, his form almost invisible in the thick undergrowth. They marched onward, slowly but steadily closing in on the forest, which was becoming more and more defined before them. Fortunately, no dangers presented themselves on this part of the journey, and soon they reached the forest's edge. The forest was dense and wild. Ancient trees with wide canopies blocked out the sky, casting deep shadows that made even the morning light seem dim. Moss covered the trunks, hanging in heavy strands from the branches, and the ground beneath their feet was wet and soft, almost like a swamp. The procession moved slowly, cautiously, but confidently. The air in the forest was cool, damp, and eerily quiet, as if the forest itself was waiting for something, holding its breath. Richard tensed. Despite Balthazar's words that the city was somewhere in this forest, all around was nothing but wild, almost primordial wilderness. No sign of civilization, only nature, wild and hostile. Each step felt like an intrusion into this green kingdom, and the forest seemed reluctant to accept them. The silence grew more and more ominous. After a while, Richard suddenly noticed that the sounds of the forest were fading. The birds that had occasionally chirped in the branches were now silent. The wind, which had rustled through the leaves, had stilled, and everything seemed to freeze. This silence felt unnatural, as if nature itself had gone quiet before something terrifying. Suddenly, a low rumble echoed in the distance. It sounded like distant thunder, but soon shifted to the sound of trees snapping. The noise spread through the forest like a rolling wave, causing Richard to stop abruptly. He braced himself, feeling cold sweat run down his spine. Something enormous was approaching. "Fall back!" he shouted, raising his hand, urging the others to stop. The people in the column, alarmed by his tone, began to slowly retreat, glancing around. But it was too late. Through the thick wall of trees, something monstrous began to emerge. First came huge shadows, shapes that snapped trees like dry twigs. Slowly, but inevitably, it emerged from the thicket. The creature was gigantic, its form made up of countless disfigured bodies fused together into a chaotic yet menacing mass. From this mass protruded limbs of various animals and humans, arms covered in fur, legs twisted at unnatural angles, and many heads, both animal and human, each wearing an expression of agony. Red veins crisscrossed the grotesque body like a web, pulsating from within. This abomination, a fusion of numerous creatures, moved clumsily but no less terrifyingly. Richard realized with horror that this was the result of the Scarlet Blight, the cursed disease that deformed bodies, turning living beings into mutants. This creature seemed to embody all the horrors spawned by the plague. The sounds it made were guttural and fragmented. Its mangled mouths let out raspy groans, mixed with growls and tortured screams. It was truly monstrous, unlike anything Richard had ever seen before. Richard knew that engaging this creature in battle would result in severe casualties. He needed to come up with something, and fast. "Move! Everyone back!" he repeated, signaling his companions to retreat. The beast moved slowly but steadily toward them, each step thundering against the ground, accompanied by the sound of cracking branches and splintering trees. Agna and Jenner rushed to Richard as the creature drew closer. With sparks of determination in his eyes, Jenner offered, "Let me burn it with fire." His hands were already glowing with magical energy, and flames began to flicker from his palms. However, Richard knew that even if Jenner could set the monster ablaze, it might not be enough to stop the beast. The creature was too massive, and a simple spell might not suffice. They had braced themselves for battle, each with sword or spell at the ready, when suddenly a deafening roar erupted from behind the creature, tearing through the air like thunder. Richard turned and saw a massive bear emerge from the forest. It was so enormous that it rivaled the creature in size. The giant beast, whose steps shook the earth, suddenly halted, sensing the presence of a new adversary. The bear roared with such ferocity that the trees trembled and birds scattered in panic. A moment later, the beasts charged at each other with fury. The giant bear wasted no time. It crashed into the monster with incredible force. Their clash was like the meeting of two forces of nature. The bear's teeth sank into the grotesque flesh of the abomination, and its powerful claws ripped through the creature's body, oozing dark, foul-smelling liquid. With a sickening crunch, the creature tried to fight back, but the bear knocked it to the ground, pinning it with its massive paw. The battle between them was terrifying. The creature fought back, letting out horrible, almost inhuman screams, its many heads filling the air with their cries. But the bear was relentless, its mighty claws leaving deep wounds in the monster's twisted body. Suddenly, as if out of nowhere, a man appeared. He wore strange attire. A cloak made of dark feathers billowed in the wind, and his brown leather pants and tall boots looked as though they were crafted by nature itself. His yellow linen shirt stood out brightly against the dark forest. But what was most unusual was his face. It was covered in tattoos, ancient symbols and magical markings intricately woven into his skin. The man sprinted toward the creature and, raising his hand, shouted something in an unfamiliar language. In an instant, vines began to rise from the ground. They shot up with incredible speed, wrapping around the creature like a serpent, encircling its entire body. But these were no ordinary vines. Massive thorns grew from them, piercing into the monster's flesh, causing it pain and binding its movements. The creature roared and struggled to break free, but the vines tightened around its body, constricting with unnatural force. The forest seemed to come alive at the command of this strange man, and the plant continued to rise from the earth. Soon, the vines had so thoroughly covered the monster that it could no longer move. The thorns tore into its flesh, causing more and more damage. Suddenly, the vines began to pull the creature down. The ground beneath it opened up, as though it were alive, and started swallowing the beast. The creature was sinking into the soil, still struggling, but its roars grew quieter until they were finally silenced as the last piece of its grotesque body disappeared into the earth. The vines retracted, and the ground smoothed over, as if the monster had never existed. Everyone stood in stunned silence, unable to believe their eyes. It was an incredible sight. The creature, so powerful and terrifying, had vanished, swallowed by the earth itself. They stared in disbelief, their mouths agape, unable to utter a single word. The forest was quiet once again, with only the victorious roar of the bear echoing nearby, standing like a guardian of the place. The man, having finished his task, lifted his gaze to Richard and his companions. At that moment, Balthazar approached on his donkey. The old man surveyed the clearing where the battle had just taken place, and upon noticing the man in the feathered cloak, he spoke. "Finn, as always, you've handled the problem well." The man, seeing the elder, bowed respectfully. "It's been a long time, master," he said with reverence, bowing his head. Balthazar nodded in response and added, "Good to see you, Finn. I see the Scarlet Blight has reached here too. We need to hurry. Can you escort us to Amelia?" Finn rose to his feet without hesitation, his eyes darkening, though there was no sign of doubt. He bowed again, straightened, and replied, "Of course, master." He turned to his loyal bear and shouted, "Ludi, guard the people." The massive bear, who had been standing nearby watching Enzio as the dog darted around, trying to befriend the huge beast, let out a fierce roar in response. Enzio, seemingly having found a new friend, sniffed the bear in return, both animals checking each other despite their vast difference in size. Upon hearing the command, the bear rose onto its hind legs, roared again, then, turning around, disappeared into the forest with heavy steps, vanishing between the trees as if he had never been there. Enzio joyfully followed after him, evidently deciding this was now his new assignment. The group set off once again, with Finn joining their ranks, guiding them through the forest. Despite his silence, everyone could sense the hidden power within him, the same power that commanded nature, brought vines to life, and caused the earth to swallow monsters. Finn remained focused, seemingly uninterested in conversation, which Balthazar evidently understood, as he didn't attempt to engage him in any. They walked in silence, but it was a comfortable quiet. Finn's presence brought a sense of security. Even Richard, always on edge in these woods, felt a slight relief knowing they now had not just a guide but a guardian of nature itself. The darkness of the forest grew thicker, and the path gradually disappeared into the dense underbrush, yet Finn led them forward with confidence. His steps were firm, and his gaze remained fixed ahead, as if he was part of the forest. They had been walking for about half an hour, moving deeper into the woods. The thick greenery grew denser, and the path had nearly vanished, swallowed by the vegetation. Finn, walking ahead, suddenly stopped and looked around. Richard immediately tensed, trying to figure out what had caught their guide's attention. He listened closely to the sounds of the forest, but heard nothing unusual. The silence was pervasive, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Raising his head, Finn spoke quietly but with authority. "Come out." Suddenly, figures began to leap down from the branches of the trees. They moved silently and swiftly, as if they were part of the forest itself. Clad in light green armor that blended with the surrounding vegetation, their faces were partially obscured by masks made of wood and leaves, giving them the appearance of forest spirits. These people moved with grace and agility, as though their bodies were made from the same material as the trees around them. When they landed on the ground, they stood in front of the group, blocking their path. From among them, one man, appearing to be around 35, stepped forward. His hair was short and tousled, as if he had slept under the open sky many times, and his face bore numerous thin scars, revealing his battle-hardened experience. His armor was more ornate, adorned with symbols of forest spirits and stylized leaves. Upon seeing Balthazar seated on his donkey, the man's expression shifted. He bowed deeply and spoke, "Master." The other forest warriors followed suit, bowing to the elder. Richard furrowed his brow, clearly surprised by the respect shown to Balthazar. He wondered, could this old man truly hold such a high title? The man, rising from his bow, approached and asked, "Master, you have returned. Who are these people?" Balthazar replied with a warm smile, "These are my companions and refugees. Lead us to the city." "Yes, master," the man replied respectfully. He raised his hands and uttered a short spell. In response, the underbrush beside the path began to part, revealing a new trail winding through the dense trees. The guide nodded, signaling them to follow him, and the group moved forward. The forest around them gradually opened up, and soon they found themselves in a place that could hardly be called an ordinary village. The homes here didn't stand on the ground, they grew from the trees. The branches of ancient towering trees intertwined with one another, forming structures that looked alive. These homes resembled massive hives, made of tightly woven branches and leaves, twisted so densely that they created cozy, sheltered dwellings. Wooden and vine staircases connected these houses, forming a network of bridges along which the villagers moved. They walked along the branches with ease, as though the bridges were an extension of their own limbs. The people, dressed in light green clothing, regarded the newcomers with caution but not hostility. When the group arrived at the village center, Finn bowed to Balthazar and said, "I must go." Balthazar thanked him, and they all watched as Finn mounted his giant bear. Looty let out a farewell roar and, with his master, disappeared into the thick forest. Enzio, seeing his new friend leave, wagged his tail sadly, as if reluctant to part ways. Soon, another man approached them. He appeared to be about 50 years old, with thick dark hair that was beginning to gray at the edges. His face bore thin lines of wrinkles, but his expression was firm and wise. He wore a green outfit made of thick fabric and a leather cloak woven from forest leaves. His attire seemed to blend with the nature around him, just like the armor of the forest warriors. The man bowed respectfully upon seeing Balthazar and said, "Master, it's good to see you again." "And I'm glad to see you, old friend. I hope all is well. But we must move quickly. Please, find shelter for these refugees," Balthazar said, gesturing toward his companions. The man looked around at the group and nodded. "I understand, master. We will find them a place." After a brief exchange, the refugees were informed that they would be staying in the village for some time. The people, slightly bewildered, began settling in, while Balthazar, after nodding to the village leader, led his companions toward the temple. Leaving the refugees behind, the group followed Balthazar down a narrow path that led deeper into the forest. They walked in silence, interrupted only by the sounds of nature. Birdsong filled the air, crickets chirped in the grass, and a light breeze whispered through the treetops. The surrounding nature was peaceful, and the tension that had followed them on their journey slowly began to dissipate. The group walked more relaxed, glancing around, feeling a sense of security. Balthazar led them confidently, with the village elder walking beside him, engaged in a quiet conversation that did not concern the others. After some time, the path began to widen, and the forest opened up before them. Ahead stood a massive statue carved from marble. It was of a warrior, fully armored, raising a sword upward as if ready to defend. His face was stern and his features precise, as though every curve of the marble had been crafted with attention and reverence. The statue stood in a majestic pose, its feet firmly planted on the ground, and the warrior's armor seemed almost alive despite being stone. At the center of the statue's forehead, there was a large blue gem. It glowed with a soft, yet deep light, seemingly otherworldly. The gem's radiance gave the statue an aura of power, and this strength permeated the air around it. Richard, stopping in front of the statue, felt more than just awe. It was a sense of grandeur, as if the very forest bowed before this marble sentinel. The statue seemed like an integral part of the forest, as if it had always been there, a guardian of this land. As they passed, the ground beneath their feet trembled slightly, and the group felt a faint vibration. Richard furrowed his brow and asked Balthazar, "What was that?" The old man, without stopping, replied with a light smile, "That's the barrier that protects the temple. This statue is one of the pillars surrounding the temple. There are several of these columns, and together they create a protective barrier that keeps monsters out. Now you can be sure. The road ahead is safe." The group exchanged astonished glances, impressed by the elder's words. They now understood that the temple was not just a sacred place, but a true fortress, guarded not only by people, but by magic. The path continued to widen, and soon the ground beneath their feet was no longer just a dirt road. It transformed into a broad paved walkway made of white marble, so pure and smooth that it seemed to shine on its own. The forest began to retreat, the trees thinning, and finally they emerged into an open space. Before them lay a small city, entirely built from the same white marble. The walls of the buildings gleamed in the morning sun, their purity and simplicity creating an atmosphere of sanctity and order. Statues lined the streets, figures of warriors, priests, and mythical creatures, all carved with elegance and precision. The city seemed like a place where art and nature had merged into one. Monks, dressed in white robes adorned with silver patterns, walked quietly along the streets. They moved like shadows, their faces hidden beneath hoods. Their garments were clean and simple, but in their simplicity, there was wisdom and discipline. The monks carried scrolls and books, occasionally stopping to speak with one another or exchange brief nods. But what caught Richard's attention the most was the sight of knights patrolling the streets. These were the warriors of the Order of the Moon, the very same he had seen before. Their armor, gleaming with silver, was flawless, and each step these knights took was filled with confidence and nobility. Their helmets were adorned with small lunar symbols, and the swords they carried seemed to be made of the same shining metal. They moved in complete silence, as if they were part of this sacred world. The city was grand, but it lacked any ostentatiousness. Everything around them breathed calm and order, as if this place had been created not for war, but for protection and contemplation. They walked down the central street, heading toward the main temple, which towered in the center of the city like a symbol of greatness and sanctity. The temple was made of white marble, its walls reaching toward the sky, and tall spires crowned with moon symbols shone against the blue sky. Massive columns supported the dome, from which light seemed to flow, as though this place itself radiated divine brilliance. The majesty of the temple was overwhelming. Its doors were intricately carved, depicting scenes of battles and ancient legends, and the steps leading up to the entrance seemed made not for mere mortals but for the gods themselves. People on the streets, upon seeing the group, first watched with curiosity but immediately bowed in respect as soon as they recognized Balthazar, as if they were in the presence of royalty or a sacred leader. Even the monks and knights going about their duties were filled with reverence and awe at his sight. Agna leaned toward Jenner and whispered, "Our old man really is a big deal." Jenner looked at her in surprise, especially considering Agna herself was the daughter of a count, a title of no small importance. The group continued along the streets, admiring the grand statues, the knights of the Order of the Moon in their gleaming armor, and the monks gliding through the city like shadows in their white robes. Enzio, who had been dashing back and forth, startling the monks and causing them to nervously leap aside, received a stern reprimand from Richard. Now the dog walked at the rear, trying not to draw attention, though his ears and tail betrayed his excitement. Soon they reached the broad marble steps leading to the massive doors of the temple. Guards, knights in silver armor, stood at the entrance. Upon seeing Balthazar, they immediately stepped aside and knelt, allowing the group to pass. The group ascended the stairs, but as they passed one of the giant columns, something strange happened. Everyone passed without issue, but when Lance followed behind them, he suddenly collided with an invisible barrier and fell to the ground with a loud thud, landing on his backside with a bewildered expression. The guards immediately noticed the incident and drew their swords, pointing them at him. One of them, not hiding his suspicion, shouted, "Dark Spawn! Why did you try to enter here?" Richard rushed forward, asking the guards to calm down. "This is a misunderstanding," he began. But at that moment, Balthazar approached, and after looking over Lance, furrowed his brow. "It seems you'll have to stay outside," the old man said calmly. "This barrier does not allow dark forces to enter, which you evidently possess." Lance got up, still looking puzzled, but with a hint of sadness in his eyes. "Well, fine," he muttered. "I'll take a stroll around the city while you're inside." Richard nodded, understanding there was no other choice, and left Lance outside the temple. Balthazar handed his donkey to the knights at the entrance and, unburdened, continued onward. The others followed him. As they entered the temple, an immense hall opened before them, with ceilings so high they seemed infinite. Everything around them gleamed with pristine whiteness. The floors, walls, and even the columns were made of pure marble. The light streaming through the windows filled the hall, giving it a mystical atmosphere. On the walls hung bas-reliefs depicting historical events, scenes from ancient battles and legends. Richard stopped in front of one of these scenes with interest. It depicted a great battle, an enormous army fighting against monsters so large their shadows covered entire legions. It was clearly a monumental battle, one that resonated with Richard's own experiences. They continued through the hall until they stopped before a statue of a warrior in full armor. He stood with his sword raised, his heroic pose embodying strength and valor. Beneath the statue was an inscription, "The Great Warrior Cyril." Richard pondered the great deeds this man must have performed to deserve such honor. While they admired the statue, a nun in a white robe approached them. Her face was serene, and her movements were calm and graceful. She bowed before them and, folding her hands, said, "The High Priestess is expecting you." They followed the nun through a long corridor adorned with statues of ancient warriors and saints, each seemingly holding a fragment of the place's history. Columns supporting the vaulted ceiling stretched along the passage, and the light streaming through the stained glass windows cast intricate patterns on the marble floors. The squad's footsteps echoed down the corridor, amplifying the sense of grandeur and sanctity of this place. Soon they found themselves in a vast hall with towering ceilings. The columns, as majestic as those in the corridor, supported the roof, and in the center of the hall stood a massive pyramid. The pedestal, made of white marble, was arranged in several tiers, but the main attraction at its top was a large blue stone shaped like a crescent moon, slowly rotating in the air. The stone seemed to glow from within, emitting a magical energy visible to the naked eye. A shimmering barrier surrounded the pyramid, a translucent veil separating the stone from the outside world, clearly preventing anyone from entering. Near the pyramid stood a woman. It was hard to describe her as merely young. She appeared to be around 35, but her eyes held an ancient wisdom, as if she were much older than she seemed. Her skin glowed softly, as if moonlight radiated directly from her body, and her long blonde hair cascaded down to her waist. She was dressed in silvery garments that flowed over her body like water. Her beauty was almost otherworldly, and in her presence there was a palpable sense of something ancient and sacred. When Balthazar, Richard, Agna, and Jenner entered the hall and approached her, the old man did not hesitate to drop to one knee and bow his head. "Lady, your servant has arrived," he said, as if uttering sacred words familiar to him. Richard, Agna, and Jenner hesitated, unsure of what to do. Richard was the first to follow Balthazar's lead, kneeling, and the others quickly followed, though their minds were filled with questions. The woman waved her hand, gesturing for them to stand. "Please rise, Cyril. Since when have you become so formal?" Her voice was soft, but there was a firm kindness in it. The old man smiled slightly and scratched his head awkwardly, adjusting his hat. When she called him Cyril, the three companions exchanged surprised looks. Unable to contain her confusion, Agna asked, "Excuse me, but why did you call him Cyril? Isn't Balthazar his name?" The woman looked at her with a kind smile, barely suppressing a laugh. "Oh, that's the mystery. You didn't know? Balthazar is just the name he travels under. His real name is Cyril, the hero of our order," she said, pride evident in her voice. Jenner, hearing this, whispered in astonishment, "I knew it. He wasn't just an ordinary man. I knew it." Richard, though surprised, took the news more calmly. Deep down, he had long suspected that Balthazar, now Cyril, was someone far more important than he appeared. Agna, on the other hand, stood with her mouth agape, recalling all the times the old man, who seemed simple and even a bit clumsy, scratched his belly and acted like an ordinary villager, completely at odds with the image of a hero. Seeing their astonished faces, the woman smiled again. "My name is Lucia." She introduced herself, her voice as gentle as a soft breeze. "I am the High Priestess of the Order of the Moonlit Night. I have been expecting you. Judging by your appearance, you have been through much lately. I suggest you rest, and tomorrow we will talk." She waved her hand, summoning a nun who approached and bowed. The nun led them to quarters prepared for their rest. Balthazar remained behind to speak with the priestess. They followed the nun through winding corridors until they reached the barracks, where the Knights of the Moon Order rested and trained. The barracks were simple but sturdy, and every element exuded strict order and discipline. As they entered, a woman, appearing to be around 40, clad in gleaming armor adorned with lunar symbols, approached them. She moved confidently and calmly, like someone accustomed to command. "My name is Captain Illyria," she introduced herself. Her face was serious, but her gaze was kind. "I lead the Moon Guard and am responsible for the safety of this temple." Richard greeted her, exchanging brief words, after which Illyria gestured for them to follow her. She led them to quarters set aside for rest, clearly used by knights. The room was simple but comfortable. Stone walls, several beds made of sturdy wood, and wooden chests for storing belongings. In the corner stood a jug of water and some rough cups. On the wall hung a shield bearing the image of the moon, the symbol of the order. Everything here exuded a military strictness and practicality. Richard approached his bed and lay down with a sigh of relief. The bed creaked slightly under his weight, but was surprisingly comfortable after the long days of travel. Feeling his muscles relax, he finally allowed himself to breathe a sigh of relief. An hour passed, and suddenly there was a knock on the door. Richard opened it to find a nun with a tray carrying dinner. He thanked her and took the food. The evening light softly illuminated the room as he ate. The simple yet delicious food restored his strength. After finishing dinner, he felt a surge of energy and decided to step outside for a look around. He noticed that Agna was nowhere to be found. After asking a passing guard, he learned that she had gone to train with other warriors of the Order. Richard pondered this. He remembered how she had always dreamed of joining the Knights, and now it seemed she had the chance. Then he decided to look for Jenner, but no one had seen him either. Left alone with Enzio, Richard patted his faithful dog on the head and decided to take a walk and explore the temple and its surroundings. Enzio, loyally walking by his side, followed his master. Richard walked down the corridor, feeling a light, fresh scent in the air. The corridor led him to an exit into a garden that turned out to be something extraordinary. This garden seemed to be from another world. It was vast, sprawling across several levels. Shrubs and flowers glowed with a soft moonlight, as if the night sky reflected in every petal and leaf. The flowers that grew here were unlike anything he had seen before. They shimmered with silver and glowed in the dark, reminding him of the magic that permeated this temple. Water gently trickled from a small fountain in the center of the garden. A light silver mist emanated from it, enveloping everything around and creating the impression that this place was alive, breathing in rhythm with the night. The trees, with their tall canopies, gave a sense of age, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, producing a melodic rustle. Richard strolled along the stone-paved path, listening to the chirping of nocturnal insects and the songs of strange birds, which made unusual, almost magical sounds. Everything around him looked as if the very sky had descended to earth, illuminated not by the sun, but by the silver light of the moon. In this place, Richard felt as though he were on the edge of a dream, and his worries gradually melted away in the nighttime tranquility. Enzio, quietly stepping beside him, behaved calmly, as if sensing the mystery and sanctity of this garden, and like Richard, was captivated by its beauty and serenity. They slowly ventured deeper into the garden, admiring its almost otherworldly beauty. The silence around them was filled with the whisper of the wind and the soft glow of the night when suddenly a melody reached Richard's ears. The sounds of a harp seemed to penetrate his very soul, evoking a strange yet pleasant feeling, as if something or someone was calling him toward it. Without hesitation, Richard headed in the direction of the enchanting music. Passing through a grove made of winding bushes, he found himself in a place where extraordinary flowers bloomed. Roses with blue petals. Their fragrance filled the air, reminding him of something ancient and magical. In the middle of the grove, on a bench, sat the high priestess, and Richard immediately recognized her. She was quietly playing the harp, her fingers gliding over the strings, drawing out soft melodies that seemed to be part of the garden itself. The sight was mesmerizing, and Richard couldn't take his eyes off her. Soon the priestess noticed him and gestured for him to come closer. Feeling slightly awkward for interrupting her music, Richard approached. As he drew near, Lucia stood up and circled him, looking him over from head to toe. Her gaze was piercing but not harsh. Then she looked at Enzio, standing loyally beside his master, and reached out to pet him. The dog didn't resist. In fact, he wagged his tail happily, clearly enjoying the attention. Lucia laughed, clearly charmed by Enzio. "It's fascinating that you have this dog," she said with curiosity in her voice. "He's a descendant of a rare breed known as luminary wolves, but he's much larger than their typical size." Richard remembered the acorn Enzio had eaten and told the priestess about it. Upon hearing his story, Lucia raised her eyebrows in surprise. "An acorn?" she repeated, frowning briefly before nodding with understanding. "You're incredibly lucky. That acorn is more than just a fruit. It's a concentrated form of ancient energy, representing the concept of beginnings. By eating it, your dog may undergo changes, and no one can say for sure what he'll become. But it's a great fortune and opportunity for both you and him." Enzio, as if understanding her words, wagged his tail even more enthusiastically, as if confirming everything the priestess said. Richard nodded, reflecting on this, but before he could respond, Lucia's gaze shifted to him, becoming more serious. "Balthazar told me about your curse," she began, locking eyes with him. "But I wouldn't call it a curse. It's a gift, passed to you by the Mother of Wolves herself. Once, 1,000 years ago, a hero from the final battle bore the same gift. He not only lived with it, but used it for great deeds. I don't believe you are cursed. Rather, great hopes have been placed upon you." Richard frowned, his internal doubts rising again. For a long time, he had considered his power a dark side of himself that he wanted to get rid of. "But I'm not human," he began, bitterness in his voice. "I'm a monster, and I don't want to be one." Lucia nodded sympathetically, smiling softly. "I understand your concern. You seek the sword guarded by the dragon to rid yourself of this burden. But the sword will only partly solve your problem. I've cast a reading for you and sensed that you'll become a crucial force in the coming cataclysms. You carry a power within you that can either save or destroy humanity. It's up to you how you use this gift." Her words triggered memories in Richard of the fortune teller who, in his childhood, foretold his destiny. Her prophecy echoed what Lucia was now saying, and it troubled him deeply. He stood in thought, reflecting on his life and how it had unfolded. He had never wanted to be the one who saved the world or other people, and this question had tormented him for a long time. Finally, he voiced what had been troubling him the most. What if I don't want to be the one who saves others, the one who saves the world? Lucia looked him directly in the eyes. Her gaze was calm yet penetrating. "Of course," she answered. "You can refuse this role. Every living being has free will, and only you can decide how to live, based on your own beliefs and experiences. But I see in your eyes that you're ready to follow this path, even if you have doubts. Think about it. Can you turn away from people when they're in danger? Perhaps some have hurt you, but they don't represent everyone. There are those who need your help, but the choice is always yours. Richard sank into deep thought. Her words rang true, yet at the same time, they left him with the freedom to choose, a weighty freedom that pressed heavily on his shoulders. He realized he carried something much more than just a curse, but was he ready to take on such responsibility? Noticing his inner turmoil, Lucia glanced over him from head to toe, observing his battered armor, damaged during his last battle with the creatures. The armor was torn in places, and Richard had been forced to wear clothes beneath it to hide his fur. "This won't do," the priestess said, shaking her head in disapproval. "Come with me. I have a gift for you." Richard looked at her in surprise but said nothing and followed her. They walked through the deepest part of the garden until they reached a small house standing right in the center. The house looked simple, with nothing about it suggesting it was a temple or sacred place. It was an ordinary wooden house, covered in greenery and hidden among the trees, as if it were a natural part of the forest. The house seemed cozy, but Richard was surprised by its simplicity, expecting something grander. Lucia approached the door and knocked, waiting. Soon the door creaked open, and an old woman appeared on the threshold. She was incredibly ancient, bent under the weight of her years, with a hunched back and a deeply wrinkled face. But there was something sharp and alive in her eyes, like a predator. The old woman scrutinized them both. The priestess bowed respectfully, and Richard, though unaccustomed to such gestures, followed her lead. "Master," Lucia began, "I've brought a guest to you." The old woman frowned in displeasure, casting a reproachful look at Lucia, and grumbled, "Why have you brought me this oaf? What do you want from me?" The priestess, ignoring the old woman's harsh tone, turned to Richard and asked, "Please, remove your helmet." Richard hesitated, but seeing the seriousness in her eyes, complied. Slowly, he removed his helmet, revealing his wolf's head, covered in gray fur. The old woman saw his lupine form and froze, her mouth hanging open in surprise. She remained silent for several seconds before shaking her head and saying, "I didn't know you were marked by the Wolf Mother. Well then, come inside." Without further questions, Richard and Lucia entered the house. Inside, the house was just as simple as it appeared outside. The walls were made of thick logs, and the furniture consisted of old but well-crafted wooden tables and chairs. Herbs and dried flowers hung in bunches from the shelves, filling the air with their scent. In the corner was a small stove, emitting a soft, warm glow. In the center of the room was a long table, cluttered with scrolls, books, and strange artifacts. Everything in this house spoke of long years of knowledge and experience accumulated over the old woman's lifetime. The old woman, moving briskly around the house, gestured for them to sit. "All right, tell me why you're here and what I can do for you," she said, her gruff tone barely masking her curiosity. The priestess then made a request. "Master, could you gift him that armor?" The old woman looked Richard over carefully, her eyes still sharp despite her age. She rubbed her chin thoughtfully, then stood from her chair and headed toward the back room without a word. Richard, feeling awkward, glanced at the priestess, who simply nodded, signaling him to follow the master. When he entered the room, the old woman was rummaging through a massive wardrobe. One of the doors was open, revealing armor that shimmered with silver and blue stones. It appeared to be crafted not from ordinary metal but from pure moonlight, frozen into the form of armor. Intricate patterns were engraved on every piece, glowing blue as if a living stream of energy coursed through the armor. The designs on the shoulders and chest wove into elaborate shapes, and small inlays of blue stone gave off a magical glow, suggesting the armor provided not just physical protection but magical defense as well. The old woman waved her hand and sharply commanded, "Take off that junk and put this on." Richard froze for a moment, stunned by the turn of events, but then obediently removed his old armor, which had become a familiar companion through many battles. He carefully placed it in the corner, as if bidding farewell to a trusted friend. Then he slowly donned the new armor. It felt alive. The metal adjusted to his body, stretching and contracting to fit perfectly. The armor wasn't just comfortable, it felt like an extension of his body, allowing him to move freely. Richard could feel the lightness replacing the previous burden, and he moved effortlessly, as if wearing no armor at all. This was true magical armor. After putting on the helmet, he stepped out of the room. Both the priestess and the old woman were already waiting for him. They examined him from head to toe, and their approving nods confirmed that he looked worthy in these new garments. "This armor belonged to an ancient hero who possessed the same power as you," said the old woman, her voice firm. "It can adjust its size to fit the wearer and protects against many magical attacks. In time, you'll uncover its full potential." Richard bowed, deeply moved by such a gift. "Thank you," he said, feeling the weight of the present. The old woman waved dismissively. "Better it serve you than just gather dust in the closet." Then Lucia leaned closer to the old woman and lowered her voice. "I didn't want to disturb you, but times are becoming troubled. Sharak has begun to make his move. Monsters are increasing everywhere, and the Crimson Sea is spreading at an unprecedented rate." Richard tensed at the mention of Sharak's name. However, the old woman, contrary to his expectations, didn't appear frightened. She merely sighed heavily, as if these news weren't a surprise to her. "It was bound to happen sooner or later," she said. "All of this was foretold." The old woman seemed to drift into memories. "You may not know this, but in ancient times gods walked this land. Even Our Lady, the moon goddess, once set foot on these grounds." Richard was surprised. He had always believed gods existed only in legends, far beyond the reach of mortals. "The gods lived among humans," the old woman continued, "and people worshipped them. There was always balance in the world. But among the gods was a demon, Sharak, who craved power. He conducted various experiments and created monsters, which displeased the others. Eventually, his dark deeds were uncovered, and the gods united to wage war against him. That battle, everyone knows of it. It became legend. Sharak was defeated, but that was only the first battle." Richard listened intently, astonished by what he was hearing. "But there was another battle," the old woman went on, "one that happened later. This time, only the gods fought, and even Sharak took their side. They battled against beings from other dimensions that threatened to destroy our world. After that battle, the gods lost much of their original power and departed to the heavens, leaving our world behind. So Sharak is not the worst of what awaits us." She fell silent, but suddenly her speech was interrupted by a noise from outside. Both the old woman and Richard immediately became alert. Without hesitation, Richard grabbed his sword and rushed outside, ready for any danger. His eyes were immediately drawn to a thick black smoke rising in the distance. He turned and saw Lucia, her face filled with worry and fear, staring in the direction of the smoke. Her expression was tense, and Richard knew something important was happening. Without wasting any time, they headed toward the source of the threat. When they arrived, a chaotic battle lay before them. At the center stood a majestic monument, a tall marble obelisk adorned with intricate runes emanating ancient energy. Surrounding the obelisk was a fierce battle. The Knights of the Moon Order and monks wielding magic were fighting monsters that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. These monsters, twisted, deformed creatures, reeking of rotting flesh, attacked everything in their path. Seeing this, Richard didn't hesitate and charged into the fray. His new armor was light and flexible, allowing him to move faster than ever before. His sword gleamed in his hands, cutting down one monster after another. Every movement was precise, and every strike was lethal. He felled the first creature, fighting like a true wolf, quick and fierce. The monster's bones snapped beneath him, and it collapsed with a sickening wheeze, only for more to take its place. Soon, Balthazar, Agna, and Lance arrived on the battlefield. Despite his age, Balthazar moved with confidence, his strikes merciless. His magic flared in the air. Agna, swinging her sword, fought alongside him. Her movements were sharp, and each strike was deadly, like those of a seasoned warrior. Suddenly, Lance appeared nearby, forming a spear of pure magic in his hands, black as the night itself, pulsing with dark energy. With precision and speed like lightning, Lance hurled the spear at the nearest monster. The creature was impaled and exploded into clouds of darkness. With cold determination, Lance conjured spear after spear, each hitting its target with deadly accuracy, piercing even the largest of the beasts. Richard fought alongside them, feeling how his armor made him faster, stronger, and more resilient. He noticed one of the monsters trying to flee, but quickly leaped after it, slicing it in half. Magic flickered around the obelisk as the monks tried to maintain the protective spells still in place. But with each attack, the monsters inflicted more damage. After what seemed like an endless battle, the monsters were finally defeated. Their bodies lay strewn across the ground, emanating the stench of decay and rot. The knights and monks struggled to catch their breath, many wounded but fortunately alive. Richard glanced around and saw that the monument they had been protecting was damaged. Deep cracks marred its surface, and the rune symbols, once glowing brightly, now flickered weakly. Lucia, seeing the damage to the monument, froze in place. Her eyes widened in shock, and she stood there, lost in deep thought. Her face was contorted with worry and pain. "This can't be," she whispered before rushing toward the temple. Richard, looking at the others, realized that the situation was growing more serious by the minute. The group rushed toward the temple, and even Lance, who had previously been unable to pass through the magical barrier, crossed it with ease this time. This in itself was a sign that something was wrong. They ran through the long corridor, filled with an eerie sense of foreboding, until they reached the hall with the pyramid. What awaited them was even stranger. High Priestess Lucia lay motionless on the floor. They all hurried to her to check what had happened, but soon they felt a weakness and noticed a strange smell seeping into their lungs. Richard looked around and saw urns scattered throughout the hall, emitting a green smoke. The smoke was a paralyzing gas. Richard realized with horror that his body was ceasing to obey him. He tried to fight the feeling, but his legs buckled, and he collapsed to the floor, just like the others. His heart froze when he saw a young man approaching the pyramid with a book in hand. A magical barrier, resembling a bubble, surrounded his head, protecting him from the paralyzing gas. Richard knew this man all too well. It was Jenner, the young mage he had taken under his wing. But now Jenner looked different. He was calm and confident, his face not glowing with kindness but something far more sinister. Jenner stepped over Balthazar, as if the old man were merely an obstacle in his path. "Oh, excuse me, I almost stepped on you," Jenner chuckled, as if apologizing for a minor mishap. Struggling against the paralysis, Richard croaked, "Why are you doing this?" Jenner turned, a slight mocking smile on his face. "Because I was curious what would happen if I removed this stone," he replied indifferently. "That's the whole reason. And of course, the stone holds a power that might be useful to me in the future." He waved his hand in a dismissive gesture. "Sorry, guys," Jenner continued, his voice dripping with irony. "I enjoyed traveling with you, especially you, Richard. But things are moving quickly and I'm running out of time. I'm afraid I have to leave you." He raised a finger, as if to wipe away an imaginary tear, and burst out laughing. The group lay on the floor in disbelief, unable to comprehend that this young mage, whom they had considered a friend, had been deceiving them all along. Agna, who had always believed in him, lay on the floor, her eyes filling with tears. She clenched her teeth, cursing his betrayal. Richard, though shocked, remained composed. After years of wandering, he had experienced betrayal before, and it seemed he had developed a kind of immunity to it. The only thing that truly concerned him now was what would happen once Jenner took the stone. The barrier that had protected the pyramid was now gone. The monument they had fought so hard to defend had likely been the source of the temple's protection. Somehow, Jenner had discovered this. Who was he really? Who was he working for? Questions swirled in Richard's mind, but no answers came. All he could do was watch as the young mage approached the pyramid. Without looking back, Jenner climbed the smooth surface of the pyramid, easily navigating the small ledges. After a few moments, he reached the top and extended his hand toward the blue stone. As soon as his fingers touched its surface, the stone ripped free with a brilliant flash, and the entire temple shook. The floor began to vibrate, and the columns trembled as if the temple itself was resisting this violation. Jenner wasted no time, stuffing the stone into his bag, which instantly dimmed as if its power had been drained. The stone, once a source of magic, was now nothing more than a tool in his hands. The young mage began his descent from the pyramid when suddenly, the hall was filled with a loud cry. Richard turned his head with difficulty and saw that it was the high priestess's master, the old woman with a stern, fiery gaze. "What are you doing?" she screamed, directing a beam of light at Jenner. The mage dodged instantly, retreating in surprise, but then his face regained its calm. He began chanting a spell, and soon a portal, crackling with violet light, opened before him. Jenner cast one last mocking glance at the paralyzed group, and with a sly smile said, "See you later, guys." With that, he jumped into the portal, which closed behind him with a bright flash. The old woman rushed to the group and chanted an ancient spell, causing a flash of light to flood the hall. The green gas dissipated in an instant. Richard felt his body regain control, and he quickly stood up, helping the others to their feet. Lucia also stood, though her face was pale, as if she had lost a great deal of strength. She looked around the hall with concern and said, "We don't have much time. We must order an immediate evacuation." With those words, she dashed outside, instructing the group to follow. Richard, still reeling from what had happened, stopped and tried to make sense of the situation. He turned to the old woman. "What's going on here?" he asked. The old woman sighed heavily, her face etched with worry, and replied, "This temple is not a sanctuary, as many believe. It's a prison. A powerful ancient being was sealed here long ago. That stone was the key keeping it locked away. Now that it's gone, it will soon be free. Run! Take everyone with you. The outer barrier surrounding the forest might hold it for a few days, but no longer. You need to leave as quickly as possible." Just as she finished, the ground beneath them began to shake. The temple groaned as if its foundations were cracking under unbearable pressure. Balthazar, sensing the imminent catastrophe, shouted, "Run!" He whistled, and from the depths of the garden his donkey appeared. Balthazar quickly mounted it, and the group followed his lead. They sprinted out of the temple, barely maintaining their balance as the ground quaked beneath their feet. Once they were outside, their eyes were drawn to the sky. There, a symbol burned brightly, flashing like fire. It was a sign, signaling evacuation. Richard immediately understood its meaning. It was a call for all residents and refugees to leave the temple and surrounding areas. All around them, people were running in panic, fleeing from the impending danger. Wasting no time, the group bolted forward, following the crowd. They raced along the path leading away from the temple, toward the village where the refugees had gathered. People like shadows darted around them, some carrying children, others clutching their few belongings. Fear was etched on the faces of everyone present. The path became rocky, and the ground beneath them wobbled in small waves. They ran, not daring to look back, each of them aware that something ancient and terrifying was closing in behind them. After some time, the group reached the village, only to be met with a scene of chaos. The village was under attack. Monsters infected with the Crimson Plague were assaulting the villagers, while the forest warriors fought valiantly in defense. Finn, accompanied by his massive bear, was fiercely battling, his beast roaring and tearing through the monsters, while Finn himself wielded nature's magic, ensnaring enemies in thorny vines. Without hesitation, Richard and his companions joined the fray. The monsters, emitting a foul stench, fell one by one under the group's relentless assault. Refugees watched the battle in terror, their faces pale with fear. Some cowered behind trees or makeshift tents, unable to tear their eyes away from the fight. When the last of the creatures were slain, Richard, breathing heavily, gathered those nearby and called out loudly, "We must leave this place. Staying here is too dangerous." The forest folk hesitated. Many were unwilling to abandon their homes, but Balthazar stepped forward, using his wisdom and authority to convince them of the necessity. His words rang true, and soon a horn sounded, signaling the gathering. More and more people began to converge on the village square, preparing to flee. Then, just as they were assembling, something terrible occurred. The entire world seemed to shake from a powerful earthquake so strong that many fell to the ground. It was followed by a deafening roar, distant yet so mighty that the earth itself trembled beneath its force. A shock wave rippled through the village, knocking people off their feet, collapsing fragile structures, and sending dust and debris into the air. Richard and the others realized the creature sealed in the temple had broken free. Its power was so immense that it felt as if the very sky quaked in fear. As the people continued gathering for evacuation, something even more terrifying happened. A dark wave, like a mist or thick smoke, began to roll in from the direction of the temple, swallowing everything in its path. This black cloud brought with it a bone-chilling cold, obscuring the world and erasing visibility. The darkness enveloped the village, plunging it into chaos. People began screaming, losing sight of one another. The darkness was so thick that the torches lit by the warriors barely illuminated the area around them, failing to penetrate more than a few steps into the murk. Panic spread through the village, with some calling out for loved ones and others running blindly in hopes of finding an escape. The darkness thickened, becoming almost tangible, and the air grew heavy. Richard, feeling the growing fear among the people, struggled to clear his mind. But the overwhelming dread pressed down on him as if nature itself had abandoned them. He knew something had to be done, but his moon magic suddenly stopped working. The black fog that engulfed the village seemed to block everything connected to magic. He looked around but couldn't see anyone in the thick darkness. People screamed and ran in panic, but it only worsened the situation. Richard felt lost and unsure of what to do when he noticed something warm and glowing nearby. He moved toward the light and, to his surprise, saw Balthazar's donkey. The group's supplies were strapped to its back, and among them was Richard's own bag. A golden light was spilling from it. Richard quickly opened the bag and found the device that Enzio had discovered earlier. It was emitting a warm, golden light, illuminating everything around him. As soon as Richard held the device, the darkness around him began to dissipate. The light spread further, turning the night into day. The people, finally able to see one another, looked toward the source of the light with hope. The darkness began to slowly retreat, leaving behind fear and terror, but no longer crushing them with its weight. Seeing the darkness withdraw, Richard shouted, "Gather around, follow the light!" People began to gather, some still glancing around in fear, while others grabbed hold of their loved ones to avoid losing them again. Richard, still holding the device, wondered where they should go next. As soon as the thought crossed his mind, the device emitted a bright beam of light, much stronger than before. The beam seemed to point a path, illuminating the way through the forest. Understanding that they needed to follow the light, Richard yelled, "Let's go! Follow the beam!" The group, along with the rest of the villagers, began moving behind the light. Step by step, they made their way out of the forest. The darkness lingered behind them, but finally they emerged into open space. Above them stretched a starry sky, free from the menacing gloom. Richard turned to look back and saw a massive crowd following him. There were monks and knights of the Moon Order, their wives and children, the forest folk, and refugees he had led here. All of them looked to him, and Richard felt the weight of responsibility for these people. He paused for a moment, unsure of what to say, but then he simply raised his hand and said, "We need to keep moving. Follow me." The procession began to move again, and soon they left the valley. When Richard looked back, he saw something terrifying. Rising above the trees, deep in the forest, was a colossal creature. Its silhouette was difficult to make out, but it seemed to be made of thick mist. Countless tendrils writhed around it, slowly rising and falling like those of a giant octopus. Everyone stared at the monstrous figure in silence, none daring to approach, and none wanting to know what it truly was. Richard, still gazing at the beast, turned to Balthazar and asked, "Where do we go now?" The old man sighed heavily, as if knowing the journey ahead would be long and perilous, and replied, "To the next city. We head north."